So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today on the Small Town PR Playbook webinar. My name is Jan Enns, and I'll be your host today for our panel discussion on stories that showcase how both elected officials and our community administrators are using best practices in public relations to solve those communication challenges that they face. I'm going to formally introduce my what I call rock star panelists in just a moment. But first, a few housekeeping items to get us started. If you've joined our web meeting, you should see the screen with the welcome sign with the PR Playbook cover there. There are two ways to listen to us. Certainly, if you've dialed in on the toll-free call, you can listen that way. Or if you like the convenience of hands-free, simply you can also join using the listening to us through the speakers on your computer. So simply go to that gear box in the top left of your corner, hit settings, and hit join online audio. We do have everyone muted today. I'll talk about some asking questions in just a moment. The presentation actually is going to run about 40-45 minutes. We've got some great questions and some great stories that our panelists will share. And we will be taking questions at the end. To ask questions, you can do it a number of ways. You can simply type it into the chat box, which is just on the top left or bottom left of your screen. And Kim will be monitoring our chat line throughout today, and we'll come to those questions at the end of the webinar. So easy peasy to do that. We also have a couple poll questions today to kick us off, so don't get too far away from your keyboard. The other exciting part for our two lucky winners today is that we are going to be doing a draw from our participants for two prizes. One is a hard copy of the Small Town PR Playbook, and the other is a free coaching call with one of the panelists of your choice. So if someone has some ideas here that spark some ideas in your mind and you want to talk to them and you're that lucky winner, you'll be able to have a free coaching call with them. Finally, today's webinar is being recorded, and after the webinar we will be sending out an email, a follow-up email that will have a link to the recording as well as a link to the PDF copy of the PR Playbook. So you'll have that for future reference. Our focus today, of course, is on the PR Playbook and how the PR Playbook can help. It's specifically designed by local government professionals and consultants and elected officials and First Nation staff to help us in our job of trying to communicate in small communities, particularly where we may not have professional communicators at our beck and call like perhaps larger communities may have. So to have this conversation, to talk about what's in the playbook, we've assembled what I call my small town all-star cast of panelists. And I'd like to introduce our folks now. My name is Jan Enns, and I'll be your host today. And on our virtual podium, I'd like to introduce our panelists, starting with Joel Mackay. He's CEO of Northern Development Initiative Trust, and Joel's going to tell us more about how the playbook came to be. Welcome, Joel.
Good morning, everybody.
Thanks. And the next is, on our virtual panel here, Renee McCloskey, who's Manager of External Relations with the Regional District of Fraser-Fort George. And Renee, you're going to share your story about working with those rural and remote communities, literally on the ground. Welcome, Renee.
Thank you, Dan. Happy to be here.
Great. Happy to have you. And tuning in all the way from the town of Smithers, our passionate social media and community engagement advocate, Mayor Taylor Bachrach. Welcome, Mayor.
Good morning, everybody. Great to be here.
And also from Northern Development Initiative Trust, the Director of Marketing and Communications in the same office there with Joel Mackay in Prince George. And also I'd like to say a big shout out for looking after all the PowerPoint slides. Welcome, Kim Hayhurst.
Good morning.
So now that you folks know a little bit about us, we want to know, like any good communicator, a little bit more about our audience. So if you scooch up to your computer, we've got a poll question for you. I'm going to just click over to that now, and we want to know a little bit about what title best describes your role. So scooch up to your computer and enter just click on one of those, and then we'll skip to the results in just a moment. This is where the Jeopardy music comes in. I have to say it's pretty exciting. We have 103 participants registered on today's webinar, and that's really exciting to have such an interest in local government communications and First Nations communications. Okay, so let's skip to the results. Looks like we've got most folks in. And what have we got here? A wide variety. So about 20% elected officials. We also have CAOs, lots of senior managers as well. We have local government staff, full-time communication staff. Yay, there's some full-time folks on there, and as well as some part-time communication staff. So excellence, a nice well-rounded audience. So our next poll question then is, we're curious to know who does have someone on their staff dedicated to communications, or even as part of their job. And here's the next poll. You can simply answer yes or no to this one. Do you have a dedicated communications person, or is it part of someone's role? Wow, this is exciting to see these numbers. They're coming in, and drum roll. Whoop. I went too far. There we go. Here's our poll. How many of you have dedicated communications person, or it's part of someone's role? 72% has someone with some function of local government, of communications, working on behalf of a local government. That is so exciting to see that, because what we did notice, and Joel and I were talking years ago when you started the research for the PR Playbook, the research that you had said that 85% had no communication staff whatsoever. So certainly while it may still be people working off the side of their desk, it's exciting to see so many people on the call today who have that as part of their role or part of their interest. We're seeing that all across BC, in fact all across Canada, where there is more engagement, there is more interest in local government communications, certainly reflected on our survey, but we're seeing that where local governments are struggling with how to do this, and we're seeing some really innovative and exciting programs that people are launching in their community. And that really brings us to our first question and our first guest, and that is to tell us a little bit about the Playbook and the stories about that innovation that we see in the Playbook. Joel, I'd like to send our first question over to you. I know the Playbook has been a long time coming, and you've done such a fantastic job in herding all these cats and getting all these stories in there. In fact, we're really excited, and I know Renee shares my excitement in her role as the chair of the recent National Canadian Public Relations Society Conference. Joel was awarded, and the Northern Development Initiative Trust was awarded the Don Rennie Award for Excellence in Government Communications for the PR Playbook. So hats off to you, Joel. Congratulations on that. My question to you, though, is that, A, it's really exciting to finally see the print copy to get the recognition, but can you tell us a little bit about how you did it? How did the Playbook come to be? Why was it developed, and why now?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks very much, Jan. And certainly when it comes to the Don Rennie, I mean, that's a huge honor for us to receive that, but it's not about me. It's certainly the Playbook is a result of more than 20 contributors from around British Columbia coming together, and so that award is really about them and the excellence that we have in local government communications in small communities around central and northern BC, southern BC, the Okanagan, the Kootenays, and obviously the island as well. Where do I start? This was a labor of love, and you go back to when we started this, 85% of small communities in British Columbia didn't have communications officers, and then we see our poll results where the vast majority of our participants today have communication staff or of some form or another. That's success. That's awesome, and part of me sheepishly wonders if we're preaching to the converted here a little bit today who already have comms officers, but certainly there's value for everybody in this. Where did we begin? I'll go back a few years. About 5 years ago, I moved to the north, came out of the media and joined the trust as a communications director, and my role was actually to be shoveled out into the smaller communities and be available to all of the municipalities, regional districts, and First Nations that wanted some communication support, wanted to develop a communications plan, wanted some media training, whatever it might be. And so I did that for a few years and traveled all around our region, and it was an amazing experience working with communities from Bella Bella to Prince Rupert, on to Haida Gwaii, up to Dawson Creek and the Northern Rockies, and then down into the Fraser Canyon as well, and through the Caribou. And one thing kept coming up, which was that not only were the communities dealing with these massive issues from a communications engagement perspective, the citizens were demanding more information than ever. Media was consolidating, so there weren't those traditional channels to get information out that local governments had previously relied on. But there were major issues too that were of national media were following: pipelines, mines, mills, forestry issues, beetle issues, social issues, crime issues, and they all seemed to be in some form or another falling on local governments, and local governments were struggling with it. And I had, through a conversation with a CAO, in fact, saying, you know, it's nice to have you here and other consultants to give us some advice, but you leave. And I come out of a council meeting at 9 or 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and I've got my marching orders, and we've got to get going and start communicating with our residents. I need something I can pull off the shelf. And so that idea kind of rolled around in my head for a little while, and I'd love to say the Playbook was my idea. It was not. But where it led was, could we create something that was an off-the-shelf solution specifically designed for CAOs, ideally in communities without communications officers or any communications capacity, also for elected officials who are new to local government or don't have a professional PR background. And we wanted it to be accessible. We wanted it to be easy to use. We wanted it to be funny. Certainly, if you're in this business for any period of time, there's always a twisted sense of humor that seems to underwrite everything that we do. So we wanted it to be a little bit more relaxed as well. And so we started floating the idea around with some of my communications professional friends in local government, and there seemed to be interest. But if it was going to happen, everybody said to me, well, that's a great idea, Joel, but I don't have the time for that. And it came to me and it's like, well, if we're going to do this, basically I had to take the bull by the horns and lead it. So we started with a literature review to ensure there was nothing else like it out there, and there were other handbooks. Some had been developed by local government associations in the past. There's lots of textbooks, but we didn't want to develop a textbook. And it was actually through conversations with Renee and certainly Shelley Burrich, who was the communications manager with the Caribou Regional District at the time. She became one of the earliest champions for the handbook. And we pulled together a steering committee of local government professionals. We developed a project and a content plan and went through God knows how many revisions of the content. And then we went out on the hunt for contributors. We wanted to create something that was fun, easy, accessible, that was going to be free to every community, any member of the public who wanted it. And it was originally supposed to be a 100-page handbook, and we were looking for local government professionals to submit their own stories, submit their own case studies, articles that aligned with the content plan. But word got around pretty quick, and I started to get calls from communications professionals from around the province. Originally, we thought that the only people to be interested in this would be people from northern BC. But then I started to get calls from Comox and Campbell River, and people were saying, I want to be a part of this, I want to be a part of this. And so that's how we ended up actually becoming and reflecting small communities around British Columbia. And it went from a 100-page handbook to a 200-page playbook. And we very specifically only chose contributors from small communities or cities in the interior and northern areas. We didn't want to use this to showcase Metro Vancouver. We really want, in addition to creating a tool that would be helpful for communities, we really wanted to showcase that small communities know what they're doing when it comes to communications and public relations, and are dealing with issues that in many cases are much more complex than what some of our metro communities are even dealing with when it comes to things like emergencies and land claims issues and major projects. And it took off from there. And over time, we also began to broaden it out to include First Nations contributors and First Nations communities. We found certainly there was a lot of shared experience between the issues around communications that First Nations communities were running into. It was very similar to what local governments were running into as well. And it was originally intended to be a 6-month project, and if I go back, I could find that initial content plan. It was 6 months. We had it all laid out step by step, who was writing what. We're going to have this thing done and finished in 6 months and out the door. And 18 months later, it was actually finished, and we got it to print, Kim, I think it was this January, and obviously it found some success. But it was a labor of love. It was a project that completely relied on volunteers and contributors, and it was not core to anybody's job. Everybody did this off the side of their desk, and the product that we have today we're incredibly proud of, but it started, as many things do in our small communities, by way of a conversation between two people about a challenge that is, it would appear, is universal.
Absolutely, and it's kind of gone viral, so to speak, because you've taken that conversation between two people, and it's certainly province-wide, and I know that some of the issues that we're seeing faced by people on the island are very similar to some of the things in smaller communities right across our province, so that's fantastic to have this resource. My next question for Taylor, for Mayor Bachrach, is the book's theme about changing tools and changing times. There's a lot going on out there, and from your perspective as a mayor, why is that theme so important, and what does it say about the struggle small towns face when it comes to communications and engagement?
Thanks, Jan. I find this aspect of the whole picture really interesting. I think that the expectations of communities and of citizens have shifted considerably over the decades, and certainly talking to people who've been in local government a lot longer than me, you see a real frustration with the increased demands, especially on local government elected officials. People, and especially younger demographics, really want more communication. They want more volume of communication. They want more transparency, and they want more effort to reach them where they're at and engage them. And I think this contrasts with the old attitude, and I've heard this from some folks, which is really that there's a frustration with an inability to grapple with the facts, and this idea that we can't teach the citizens, or we can't help them understand. They don't want to vote. They don't want to understand, and eventually, if they don't like what we're doing, they'll just vote us out at the end. And I think that's a very small number of people who have that perspective. But it's shifted almost entirely to this idea that if we reach out and we engage citizens in decisions, we help them understand the information, we're transparent about the rationale behind decisions, that ultimately there are some huge benefits to be gained. And there's some new tools that have really transformed the whole communications and engagement realm. I think overall it's predicated on the notion that if more people are informed and involved in the decision-making process, it's going to result in stronger, more resilient, and more equitable decisions down the road. People want some agency, though, and I think our role, especially as elected officials, is to help our citizens feel that agency. So I talked a little bit about the benefits, I think, of this shift in expectations around a more informed electorate and the creation of more social trust and more community cohesion. I think the other benefit is that with the new tools that have come onto the scene, it gives us more control over the message. And before, with local government communications, really because the tools were quite limited and local governments relied heavily on the news media, a lot of the message and the information was reliant on the timelines of the media and was filtered through reporters and through that process. And with these new tools, we have much greater control, and we're able to communicate to large audiences in a very timely and efficient way. Of course, it creates some challenges, and I know that pretty much everyone in the local government world is grappling with those challenges. It means we need to learn new skills and be willing to engage in new ways. The biggest challenge that I've seen, and this relates specifically to social media, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, is around civility and the challenges when you create new avenues for communication and conversation with the community. There's always going to be a portion of the community that doesn't engage in a civil way, and how we how we deal with that behavior. And I think that the new tools have unfortunately lent themselves to some really unfortunate behavior in some cases. The other challenge is around capacity, and small communities feel this especially, I think. And your earlier remarks, Jan, touched on this a little bit. If we're going to really seize this opportunity to communicate proactively with citizens, it means that we need to think about that role in our organizations in a serious way. I think in the past, communications was always seen as sort of a junior skill set, something that could be done either off the corner of someone's desk or given to a relatively junior staff member. If we're going to put it at the center of what we do, communications and engagement, it means that we need to grapple with resourcing it effectively. And it's wonderful to hear the outcome of the poll, and to hear that lots of communities have taken up that challenge. Our community here in Smithers, we're partway along the evolution of really ramping up our communications capacity, and we've got a ways to go, but we've made some big strides in recent years. Obviously, it's a question for municipal councils, because if we're going to resource it effectively, it means having a conversation about how that stacks up against other human resource needs that we have in the organization, and ultimately whether we're willing to dedicate the budget to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots going on, and I want to come back and touch on two things, the resources and also the social media piece. As we move forward, but definitely we're seeing this demand, and we're also seeing how local governments like the town of Smithers have some really innovative ways of stepping up to that. And I think that, as Joel said earlier, there's some tools in the playbook to help us do that. But really important conversations that are happening right across our province. When we're talking about engagement in those rural and remote communities, Renee, I have a question for you, building on what Taylor had talked about, in terms of how do we actually do this? You know, we saw a couple examples there, and we know sort of what some of the bigger strategy might be that we need to do this. What are some of the examples or some of the tips that you can give around how to build that engagement in our communities?
Sure, thanks, Jan. So if you've had a chance to take a look through the book, you'll note that it's just packed with some great advice and examples of effective engagement strategies from local governments, small, medium, large, that really show different tools and strategies that are being employed. That's great to see. Also, Section 3 of the book has a piece written by the former Caribou Regional District Comms Manager, Shelley Burrich, that's specific to rural and remote communities that I think is really worth a read as well. For me, it really comes down to planning. So regardless of whether your campaign is targeted at a rural or a remote population or a more urban population, the strategies, the tactics may change, but the strategies and such are going to be fairly consistent. So in the first section of the playbook, Jan has actually put together an overview of communication planning that really covers those basic steps. So regardless of the size or scale of your program, the steps are all going to be the same. What are you trying to achieve? Who are you reaching? What do you want to say? How are you going to get your message out? And how did it go? So for me, it really comes down to knowing your audience and who you're trying to reach. And as local government, I'd say that we know that better than perhaps our peer levels of government. Just because of the nature of the services that we provide, we have so much more interaction with the public. The public swim in our pools, they use our landfills, and they drive on our roads. So when it comes to knowing your audience, if you're the one that's put in charge of developing an engagement strategy, if you yourself don't have that much interaction with the public, don't overlook getting advice from those on the front line of your organization that do have that interaction. Talk to the receptionist, the public works foreman, whomever. They are going to likely have some pretty good insight about your audience that you may or may not have appreciated or understood. And I guess to maybe give a quick example of this, a few years back when we were dealing with a fire to the west of Prince George, and it Taylor just spoke of kind of the shift from relying on media as a big message deliverer for us. We really saw that media wasn't really getting out the information that we needed to get to this particular community that was impacted by this fire. We talked to a lot of our staff in community services and planning to try to get a sense of who are the influencers in that community, who do we need to reach to try and get proper information to these people. And through that, we were able to leverage some really good contacts with community associations, and really found that to be far more effective than dealing with traditional methods like media. So just kind of one example about how you go about knowing your audience and understanding who they are. There's a few different ways to do that. Another couple of examples, just when you look at who your audience are, and then how does that influence the tools and tactics you may use. Back in 2014, our regional district held a referendum in a small community east of Prince George. So at the time, the school district was rebuilding an elementary school. And as part of a unique partnership, the community voted in favor of funding an addition to the school that would serve as a community activity center when the school wasn't utilizing that space as a gymnasium. So it was a very, very small community, not well serviced by traditional media and such. And I think we have a tendency to really look at sort of what are the new hot and sexy tools that everyone's using and sort of get caught up in the excitement that everyone's got to use that. And I like to use this campaign as an example to say, sometimes the most basic tactics can still be your most effective. So for that community, because of its nature being so removed and remote from a lot of our traditional outreach, we went right back to basics, and we're looking at utilizing posters in the general store, in the post office, direct mail, all of those sorts of things, as opposed to really spending a lot of money on paid advertising and other sort of mass tactics like that. Conversely, when we have a situation like when we're reviewing our regional solid waste management plan, for example, now that's a process that involves our entire region. So that's involving populations within our major centers like Prince George, Mackenzie, McBride, and Valemount, along with our rural communities. So when we look at a program like that and getting the message out and engaging with people to try to get their feedback around how we can deliver services that meet their needs, then something like that really is sort of more the full spectrum. So in something like our regional solid waste management plan review, there's something where we're really looking at utilizing paid advertising, both broadcast and print. There was extensive social media campaigns as well to help us get that direct engagement, particularly when it came to some surveying that we were doing. We did the traditional open houses and all of those kind of stakeholder groups. But for me, it really comes down to knowing your audience. You can't get enough information about them, really trying to find out who they are, where are they going to get their information, who are the people that are influencers in those communities. I think all of that is pretty critical.
So critical in a small community where it's not, the anonymity isn't there that you might have in a larger center. So if you're talking trash about solid waste, you might also be talking trash.
Oh, and there's lots of that when it comes to solid waste.
Exactly. Oh, thanks. So really knowing your audience and then tailoring the tactics. And what I'm really hearing, Renee, is that the magic is in the mix.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, but let's come back to that part about there's no segue between talking trash and social media, but coming back to the conversation about social media, Taylor, you had talked about, I know you're a passionate advocate of using social media to both inform and engage your community. So with that, I know you've actually written some tips here about the social media from the Mayor's Chair. There anything you can give us in the way of some ideas about how to approach social media, both for community engagement and communications, but also from your role as an elected and also your perspective on what the administration might do as well?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jen. As you said, I'm a big advocate of using social media for local government, and I think its potential is really limitless. Obviously, it comes with some downsides, and I can talk a little bit about those. But social media is a super inexpensive, efficient way to reach a large number of people. And the real beauty of it is that because it's social, it enables a conversation. So it's not just one-way communication. It allows a back and forth between residents and elected officials, and helps that process of ensuring that residents really understand what's going on and have access to accurate information and can have their voice heard. Mm-hmm. So, one of the real benefits, and I think Renee spoke to this in terms of the new tools versus the old tools, and that sometimes simple approaches and offline approaches can be really effective. I think social media can work complementary to those approaches. So one of the ways we've done that is through promoting events online. We just had a really successful town hall meeting about our arts and culture facilities, and it was an in-person meeting, but we were able to promote it using Facebook pages and really ensure that as many people as possible knew about it. Then when we had the event, I live streamed it on my Facebook page, so people who weren't able to be at the event itself were able to watch it and comment through the Facebook page. It's really limitless what you can do, and I found anyway that it can be really fun. One of the tips that I shared in the playbook is just the importance of using sort of an authentic voice. It's a very personal medium, and I think the way to engage people is to engage them in the same way that you would in a coffee shop or on the street. That it's a personal voice. Certainly as an elected official, that's the way that I use it. It's probably different as a corporate communications tool. But the response has been super positive. I've heard from people who say they feel more engaged and connected than ever before to local government. There is a bit of a dance when it comes to working with the corporate side of things, and a lot of residents want to provide input and feedback and questions about town operations through my Facebook page. So it really requires a lot of communication through staff to help channel those questions and feedback through to the appropriate people, and then close the loop with the residents who made the initial inquiry. If you want to see that approach on steroids, I'd encourage folks to check out the Spanish town of Jun. I believe it's pronounced Jun, but it's spelled Jun. And I stumbled on an article about this town where it's a town of 3,500 people, and the entire town is run on social media. So if you want to see an extreme example, check out the New York Times article on Jun. A little bit. Can I touch on the downside really quickly, or do we have time?
I'll add that as a resource.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, I think, Jen, everyone's aware of the downside of social media, which is that for some reason, even though it's not entirely anonymous on things like Facebook, it can bring out a really negative side of people, and people feel like they need to communicate in this really exaggerated and sometimes nasty way. So dealing with that when you come across it, I think, is one of the skill sets that people need to develop if they're going to use the tools effectively. And certainly my colleague Nicole Reed, the mayor of Maple Ridge, has had a really bad experience with online trolls and bullying and harassment using social media. So certainly some things to watch out for. Nahid Nanchi, the mayor of Calgary, has a wonderful social media commenting policy. You can check it out on his Facebook page, and it's got a little bit of his own brand of humor injected in there. But I adopted that as one of the tools that I use for helping ensure that people who are engaging do so in a way that's productive. I could tell all sorts of stories about how things have gone and the different mistakes that I've made. But another one of the downsides, I think, is that using it effectively means using it a lot, and that has an impact on all of our lives. I think a lot of us are seeing how social media affects our daily lives, not always in positive ways. And then the last thing I'll say is that because it's such an effective tool and more communication is moving to social media, ultimately the control over that tool rests with Facebook and Twitter and the algorithms that they use. so in some ways you're at the whims of these giant corporations that make changes to the tool, and that can affect the way that you communicate. But overall, it's evolving every day, and the new tools like Facebook Live are really transforming the way that we're able to reach out to people and make them feel part of the conversation. And I think in the balance, it's mostly upside.
Yeah. No, I think that's fantastic. I love the points that you shared, though, those tips as well, because they're not just for elected. I think they're also for anybody, the pause and breathe and how we handle some of the tough conversations on social. But the fact that it's there, and as I was saying earlier, if we're in the social media game, if we've opened a Facebook page, it's like opening a customer service window, and we need to look after it. We need to engage on it. We can't just set it and forget it. We need to be there. We need to be present. So some great tips in the book and that you've shared there as well, and those resources for sure. We'll do that. And, of course, we can follow you on Facebook too and see what your policy says as well. Thanks for sharing that. So moving from some of these bigger pieces about we'd love to, here's how we'd like to do that, off the side of your desk, Renee, what are some quick tips that you can share with us about how we might actually be able to do this off the proverbial side of our desk?
So I'll try not to go too much on a rant, because I too was heartened to see how many people have already invested in communications support, and so that's excellent to see. But I know it's still something that many organizations struggle with. They have the need and yet aren't able to fulfill that resource, or they view that it is a fairly easy task and can assign it to someone junior. So I recall on a recent trip to my chiropractor, she was sharing about a number of patients that she treats who they go home and get their husbands or wives to try their hand at cracking their own back so they don't have to go in. And, of course, that never works out all that well. And so her response when she's faced with these patients is interesting. And do you try your own dentistry at home too? So for me, I view communications the same. It's a profession. It's something that really needs to be resourced appropriately. It's so critical to everything we do and continues to be an area that many are reluctant to invest in. If you are one of the ones that don't have access to in-house communications support, there's a few things I would recommend. There's a number of people that Joel's talked about that have contributed to the Playbook, and I know all of them would certainly be more than happy to have a conversation with you. Most of these people are working full-time in local government, but there are a few consultants I know who would be happy to support you on a more regular basis if that was something you'd be looking for. Even something like considering developing a job description, those sorts of things. For some, the moment you realize you need communication support is the moment that a reporter calls and asks you a question about something you were hoping nobody was going to pick up in the agenda or whatever it might be. So if that's the case, I mean, really that's what this whole book was designed to do. And the book has got some basics on how to handle those situations. There's a really, really helpful section on media, why they matter, and even a bit of a news release template if you're in a situation where you've got about 20 minutes and you've got to get a news release out now and you may just not have the opportunity to engage a communications professional to assist you with that. So there are those resources there. So I'm going to close, I guess, with a final plea, and again, this is probably preaching to the converted given the audience we have on the line today, but you don't wait until your budgets are due before you hire your finance manager. So don't wait until you're in the midst of a crisis before you look at properly resourcing the communication needs for your organization.
That's a great analogy, Renee. Thank you for that. That's excellent. One of the things you mentioned there, too, was about the media, and it is truly all about relationships. Joel, I have a question for you, certainly in your previous role as Communications Director for Northern Development Initiative Trust, and also you've worked with a lot of small communities. You've also been a journalist. What do you feel would be where can we get the biggest bang for our buck when it comes to small town PR?
Yeah, well, I'll answer that question in a couple of ways. I think within the playbook, we designed it with specific sections so that it was useful. It's not meant to be read front to back. It's a pull off the shelf when you need a solution, flip to the tab section for whatever you need. And I think one of the things that gets lost in the conversation around public relations and communications is that within that overarching branch, there's a whole bunch of people who are very good at specific things, but not everything. And so my background when I came into PR was obviously the media, so I worked to my strengths, and that was an area I knew well. But I'm not and wasn't an expert in marketing, and Kim will be happy to remind everybody that I'm still not, and rely on her for that. Certainly, there's other areas as well. Government relations would be another aspect of public relations, community engagement, social media. All of these things are various issues management, crisis communications. They're all aspects of the job that if you're the only person wearing the PR hat in your organization, you're going to have to tackle, but it may not be your background. You may not know how to use it. And so the biggest bang for your buck in the playbook is that for me, frankly, as a PR professional, I might know the media section well, but I don't know what I'm doing when it comes to necessarily event management. I don't know necessarily what I'm doing when it comes to social media. I'll be the first person to admit that personally I'm not on Facebook. I'm a bit of a Luddite that way. And I'm not necessarily the expert in crisis or issues management communications either. And so for me, if I ran into a situation and I didn't have comm staff to support me on those specific things, I would be reaching into that portion of the book and giving myself some pointers. And that's why you see articles in the book where, for example, on the order of flags at an event, what order do the flags go in order to ensure that we're properly respecting federal government, provincial government, traditional territory, and then, of course, the communities that we're in. Analytics tools for using social media. It's one thing to engage with social media and use it as a tool to engage with your audience, but are you really having an impact? Do you know how to use analytical tools, and what are the analytical tools that are out there? And so we included an article on that. And then certainly the article that's entitled "My Town's Website Sucks, What Do I Do?" is a common theme in communities across British Columbia, across Canada, frankly, where the communities have a website, but it's Web 1.0, and they're struggling with, well, how do we update this? How do we make it so that our residents will use it? And I know here in Prince George just went through a major exercise on launching a new website and has had some incredible success with their new website, and I would encourage everybody to take a look at it if you haven't been on it already. Leaping back into the media is the ever-present sort of question that you get from the local government elected officials as well as administrators. Is how do we engage with them? How do we work with them and get what we want out of them? And I think it's a two-way relationship, and a lot of it is about removing the mystique around the media. I talked earlier about the consolidation in media, and we're seeing our communities' newspapers disappear, or in some cases online news sources disappear, and as well, you're not seeing the budgets in the Global BCs and the CTVs and the CBCs necessarily to come up and cover stories in small communities like they did in 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so the section on the media in the playbook is really about, here's some tips and tricks for how to work with the media, how to avoid some of the pitfalls, such as, off the record, and why am I on the phone with this reporter and there's a sudden awkward silence? How do I deal with that specifically? And I think when I go back to when I first arrived here in Prince George, we had a media outlet here in town that a number of outlets or organizations were concerned about engaging with. They felt uncomfortable with it. There was questions around whether they were accredited or not, and accredited in quotation marks is a 20th century term that doesn't really matter anymore. The real question around a blog or a website or a media outlet is, do they have audience? And if they have audience and it's a local audience and they're following what this outlet is writing about your town, then you should probably pay attention to them and be willing to do interviews. And as a trust, we had an awkward relationship with them, and so I'm always of the mind when it comes to any issue or relationship issue where you have a problem, you don't run away from it, you run toward it and find out what the challenge is. And so that's what we did as an organization, and started sitting down with the owners and the reporters in this media outlet on a monthly basis and trying to understand what their concerns were, giving them open access, going out of our way to really develop that relationship, not with any agenda in mind other than to have a better relationship and ensure that they were getting the information that they needed so they could report back to their audience, which was quite large and was interested in what our organization was doing. And we turned it around. It was a 180. And to this day, that site has just actually recently closed down. But I have a very close relationship with the owner. And she actually, Elaine Meisner, she contributed an article to this playbook. And so it's things like that in the playbook that I think are really, really valuable that anybody can use. And you might, as a local government professional, have depth in one area, and maybe you're not going to pay attention to that part of the playbook. But there's 10 or 11 other areas where they will be incredibly valuable to you when you get around to looking at your website or putting on an event or doing some marketing or engaging through social media, or maybe, in fact, trying to get a stronger relationship with your local, regional, or even a provincial media outlet.
Right. Really, really some key points there about relationships count, about working with the media as that amplifier, and also that coming back to that social media piece, the tools. But it comes down to that connection before content. That's so critical in what we do. So great tips on that. And thanks for those biggest bang for your buck in what's in the playbook there. So our last question, just moving back to you, Taylor, and just to talk about how we can up our game using the playbook. But in particular, you know, we keep hearing that communications and community engagement is so critical to our communities and so important. Why is it? From your position or your perspective as a mayor, why is it so under-resourced in our local governments? And can you give us any tips to help local governments garner more support for communications in their organization? Maybe it's with their council, their board, or their community.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that's really the challenge we face, which is that our communities are responding really well to efforts to engage citizens and increase communication and transparency. And the challenge is translating that and helping people understand that function takes time, and it takes human resources, it takes training, all of these things. And I think it's really an area where elected councils need to show leadership and bite the bullet and put some resources towards these things, because we've seen that the rewards are really there. And maybe part of the challenge is making the connection. So translating things like attendance at events or the number of people engaged by different things to really build the case for making these investments. It's actually a conversation in Smithers that we haven't yet had, but a similar example I was talking with our CAO this morning about was around IT support. And you know, until 5 years ago or so, we didn't have a dedicated IT person. And because of some of the challenges we were having around IT, we were able to build that case and say, you know, for an organization with over 60 staff, we really need someone dedicated to this function. And I think the same case can be made for communications. And when it is, I think we'll see great results. Just looking at these next slides here, the other thing that I would encourage folks to do is to experiment and try new things. There are so many tools out there right now. There are so many different formats for events and different ways to engage people. One of the things I've really appreciated is our staff's willingness to try new ideas and see how they work, and then we have a conversation afterwards about whether we try it again. One thing we're trying this year around budget consultation is an online budget simulator, which allows residents to go onto a website and move these sliders back and forth and adjust their taxes and adjust service levels and learn a little bit about the decisions that council is faced with around budget time. The slide we're on right now shows one of our engagement sessions with a local architecture firm doing interactive things with residents and really allowing them to roll up their sleeves, I think can pay dividends. And then the last one is a sort of a fun event. We're not doing it anymore, but we did an event called Pints and Politics at a local pub.
Whoops, I went to the wrong slide there.
Are you there? No?
There.
I think maybe my connection has shorted out on me here, but yeah. Well, that's not Pints and Politics. That's a picture of some engagement I did with school classes, and I do lots of school tours at Town Hall.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the last slide there was just an event that we tried for a little bit at a local pub and encouraged people to come out after work and talk to the mayor about what's going on. It's not something we do anymore because the pub was actually open at the time and some people weren't there to talk to the mayor, and so it was kind of hard to distinguish between who was there to engage with mayor and council and who was there just to have a quiet beer by themselves. But I think it's an example of that experimentation and trying to find what works well.
I love it. I mean, and I love the look of it and the branding of it. And you're having those face-to-face conversations, be it at a pub or a Tim Hortons or wherever. And then you're also, I know you're taking those conversations online, which I think is very successful because it's all about that accessibility and having, that creating that connection, and particularly in small communities where you can have that face-to-face conversation and stand down some of the fears or apprehension people might have about something that we're up to as a local government. From a public relations perspective, when I think about building the business case that you mentioned, the rule of thumb from public relations perspective is that for every hour that we can spend up front planning out our communication strategy or around our issues, we can save 8 to 10 hours down the road in terms of fixing misinformation, damage control, damaged relationships, all those things. So the ratio is there from a public relations perspective. So throw that into your business case, and hopefully we can move forward with some things. So thank you for sharing some insight on that, Taylor. That's excellent. Okay, moving over now, we do have about 7 to 10 minutes left for questions. We've got a great panel here. Thank you so much as well to each of you, and we'll field some questions over here. We've got 4 queued up here. So first one we have is, do you have a job description for a communications coordinator you can share? Anyone? Renee, is that something I can field over to you?
If you want to share my contact information with whoever that question came from, then you can follow up with me afterwards, and happy to share some that I'm familiar with.
Sure, and also on Civic Info, they've got the documents, and you can go into search, and there's job descriptions there. So that's an excellent resource as well, and maybe that's a place for that resource. Another resource as well for local governments is that working with Civic Excellence, Civic Info, we also have a LinkedIn closed group for communications professionals. So you can go to LinkedIn, you can look at local government professionals, Civic Info, local government professionals, and ask to join. And that's another venue where people can share that information. I know that the corporate officers have one on LinkedIn as well, so we wanted to copy that, and we've been sharing things like job descriptions there too. So great info there. Another one here is about any campaigns or case information, case studies about increasing voter turnout. Who wants to talk to that?
Well, unfortunately, nothing that I've been involved with specific to increasing voter turnout. Certainly information, making sure voters have the right information or correct information.
Mm-hmm.
But,
I'm happy to.
Yeah. Taylor,
I could jump in there as well. I'm not. I know that there's a lot of research out there, mostly from other levels of government, around the role of social media in voter turnout, and some fairly encouraging results. I think one of the key things is sort of the I voted. social cues, so people sharing photos of themselves with buttons that say I voted, or somehow using an online app to indicate that they voted and to show their social circle and act as a bit of a reminder that it's happening and it's something that people are doing. I think that has been shown to boost voter turnout. I don't think we have any great examples from the local government level, but certainly there are lots of studies out there, and should be fairly easy to find online.
Yeah, and there's some really neat campaigns that have happened with other local governments where they've had, be a voter and encouraging voting. And I'm trying to think off the top of my head, it was either Coquitlam or Port Coquitlam had one in the last election that was quite colorful and engaging from the look of it, at least what I saw on social media and on their website. So definitely something I think, though, that we need to work on to increase voter turnout. It's all about that engagement, and that's one campaign. But going back to what you said earlier, Taylor, engagement is an ongoing process, and things like social media allow us to engage every day. Okay, another question here, and if you want to ask a question, there's two ways to ask. Certainly, the easiest is just to type it into the chat box at the bottom left or top left of your screen. I got a great one here from one of our participants. I like the pints and politics idea. Curious as to who paid for the pints. Taylor.
Good question. I'm trying to remember back. I'm looking at that slide. What year was that we did that? Might have been 2014 or so. Who paid for the pints? Well, I think either I did or people bought their own pints. I think that was how it worked.
Right.
But I don't remember exactly. I do know that the pub that hosted the event put out some appy platters, and I don't think it was framed as free beer. If it was framed as free beer, I think it would be tremendously successful. It's just finding the budget for the kegs that's the challenge.
Yeah. There's a lot to be said, though, for breaking bread with people and having refreshments on hand if that's what it takes. I know talking to some of the CAOs in Alberta, they've had in the smaller communities, they have like a community barbecue or something like that where they bring people together over food and really in a fun and engaging way, as opposed to perhaps sometimes it's the typical open house where we're trying to share some information that not everybody necessarily wants or wants to hear about, or much less pay for as a taxpayer. So love the idea of pints and politics and food. Here's another question on our chat line as well. Are there any downloadable print materials that municipalities can use for open houses available? I think of resources, again, pointing to the Civic Info LinkedIn site. I think of the group, the Civic Info Documents page. But if anyone else has some information to add or some information to share about resources for an open house.
I would jump in on that quickly and just go back to the book. One example is the Talktober that the City of Prince George did over the last, I think it's been running a couple of years now. In the back of the book, you've got Rob Van Adricum and Mike Kellett, who both gladly left their contact information in the back of the book. They've been very successful with the Talktober open house sessions and information campaign, and I would encourage you to reach out to them directly and ask them if they'd be willing to share some of their insights and perhaps some of their materials as well.
Yeah, great idea.
There's an interesting dynamic, I think, Jen, between the choice to hold an open house format event versus a town hall format event.
Right.
And my experience, at least, has been that the town hall format events where you have the ability for people to speak to a crowd and for people to hear each other tends to get more participation. The open house format is often a bit more diffuse, a little bit more one-on-one. It probably works for some people who might be intimidated contributing in a town hall forum, but certainly in terms of attendance, we've seen much higher attendance for the town hall style events.
Right. And it is that connection that you have in a smaller community too. It probably depends on the issue as well, or they want the divide and conquer strategy of having an open house beforehand, and then the town hall. A couple questions here on the just as we wrap up as well. one more question, actually, I guess we can take. We can certainly stay online as well. We did promise that we would wrap up at 11:30, but I'll just get to this one quick question about engaging our frontline and customer service staff are not confident crafting messages or using communications tools. And while a communication plan or strategy would be awesome, it's months away and may or may not be resourced. Where can we start in-house to develop our staff and at least do something? Great question. And with that, what I really encourage you to do is look at the playbook. And Joel, I think in the playbook, and I know you know this like the back of your hand, there's actually a section on how to write a message that's really good, conveying your message and how to craft that message and what they are and why you need to write them. So that's a good.
Yeah, there absolutely is around messaging, and there's simple tools with that too, and it depends on the size of your community and what the issue is that your frontline staff are dealing with. But I mean, one of the things that we've tested out and had some success in communities in the past is for your frontline staff who are at reception or at the front desk at town hall, if you know as a staff member that you're likely that week to have residents pop in and ask questions about certain things, then create a little message sheet that arms your frontline staff with the information they need to answer the questions right there, so that they don't have to point the resident necessarily to, oh, you need to talk to a director or a general manager necessarily. If it's simple information that they can convey, just having a message sheet in front of them, often they won't even necessarily look at it as staff members. It just gives them the confidence to answer the questions and share that information with the public. So that's a simple way to get on that ahead of or in parallel with the development of your own communication strategies. But there's a lot of tools and a lot of tricks to that out that you can try over time. And just to build off of what Taylor said, experiment and feel free to experiment a little bit and try different things.
If I can just jump on to what Joel said, it's Renee. And this, again, is really a good example of where you can utilize your frontline staff in helping you with some of this stuff. We will regularly use our frontline staff in developing the FAQs that Joel's talked about. And we may anticipate what we think some of the questions are that people are going to ask, whether it's a change in landfill hours or fees or whatever it may be. But then you go down to the receptionist and she's like, well, no, like we're getting 7 questions today just on this particular thing. The other way that we've utilized some of our staff as well is kind of use staff in different departments as a bit of a focus group on some of that messaging as well. So if we're developing a news release or an FAQ sheet on something, I may go to a couple of people in our finance department who are completely removed from what the program is and what it does, and just say, can you give this a read and just tell me, does it make sense to you? And sometimes you can get some really, really great feedback that way. So it kind of gives you a chance to use your own staff, involve them, but it also gives you some feedback and helps maybe prevent some pitfalls in some of your messaging before you launch it.
Absolutely. Making sure that if they can't understand it, then how are we explaining it to the folks in the community? So great tips there. Thank you, both of you, all 3 of you. As promised, our webinar was going until 11:30 today. Now, I believe some of our callers can stay on a little bit after. I will for sure, and I know Kim for sure as well. But I just need to wrap up the webinar as promised. But I wanted to share with you some information as well. We're going to send a follow-up email. We're going to have the link to the PDF copy of the book as well as this recording, so we'll have that. There's a couple resources that have been mentioned throughout today's webinar. We'll throw those into the email as well. We also have a feedback form that we'd love for you to fill out. But today's also not quite over until we do a draw. So all I need is, Taylor, I need you to give me a number between 1 and 103.
Wow, 78.
78. Okay, my 78 then says Shaylee Wilbur. Shaylee, you have won your own very own hard copy of the PR Playbook. So we will get that to you, and you are in Dawson Creek. So congratulations, Shaylee. councillor there up at the city of Dawson Creek. And Joel, do you want to give me a number between 1 and 103?
42.
42. Okay. I have 42. We have here Dawn Lowe from Revelstoke. Dawn, congratulations. You get a free coaching call with the panelist of your choice. Now, we will follow up by personal email to each of you. Congratulations to our winner. I'd like to say again, thank you so much to our panel. Joel, Renee, Taylor, Kim, you guys have done an awesome job at really bringing the playbook to life. Joel, I'm so proud to be part of this project with you as well. As I say, I'm going to let folks go back to work if they need to go back to work, but we will stay on the line and be able to answer some questions. Thank you to each of you, Joel, Renee, Taylor, and Kim, for your time today, and as well as our participants.
Thanks so much, Jen. That was a real pleasure.
Jen, you did a terrific job, and thanks everybody for joining us. That was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Thank you. So those of you that are able to stay, we do have a couple more questions online, so we can continue, allow folks to go on, but I didn't actually check with you, Taylor and Renee, if you were able to stay a little bit longer.
Yeah, I'm good for a little bit.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay. Then I will continue on, but I do know, and we'll record this part as well, but I just wanted to make sure that if folks needed to leave that we had gotten through the resource piece. So I have a question here about 65% of voters are Gen X and millennials. How best to communicate with technology migrants, those 65 plus who may have not grown up with swift technological advancements or social media? Who wants to handle that one?
I can give it a crack. I think it's a fabulous question. I do think with social tools, what we see in our community, and the great thing about Facebook is it does give you demographics on who is engaging with your Facebook page. So you're able to see which age demographics are most engaged. And I think there might be some misconceptions or misperceptions around older demographics and their uptake of things like Facebook. I see a lot of people in our community that are using it really effectively, and certainly the participation in my social media doesn't skew as young as people would think. So I don't think that it's exclusive to younger demographics. Mm-hmm. But it does point out the importance of having offline strategies as well, and making sure that you're reaching out to seniors in your community in ways that work for them. And the best way to find out what works for them is just to ask. And going to where people are at. If people are on Facebook, then go to them on Facebook. And if they're hanging out at the coffee shop, go to the coffee shop. Yeah. Of course, the challenge with face-to-face is that it's more resource intensive. It's a little less efficient. You can't just do it from your couch. You have to really get out there. But I think that's really important too.
Right. Absolutely. Anything to add to that, Renee or Joel or Kim?
I think just, it's important not to get too hung up on, one tool over another. People are diverse and different, and one mechanism is not going to work for all. Even if you're dealing with a small population of maybe only, a couple hundred households, you can't rely on just one method to get through. So if you're finding that social media is working well for a particular demographic, but you're still not having success reaching a different sector, you got to get out there and try a few different things.
Joel or Kim, anything to add?
I think everybody's pretty much spot on there. It's just a lot of mix between new technologies and old-fashioned, on-the-ground, getting out there, putting up some posters, talking to people where they are.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Joel, anything?
Joel's had to step out.
Okay. All right. So one last question here on the chat line then. Online Facebook forums have been a challenge for us, as that seems to be where citizens go to ask questions and vent about local government. Although we monitor the page, we do not comment as per our social media policy. How are other communities dealing with these online community pages? Excellent question. I'm going to start with Taylor on this one and your passion for social media, because this is something you touched on earlier as well.
Sure, this is a fabulous question, and certainly something that we see in almost every community, these pages popping up. We have one in Smithers called Smithers Customer Service Review, which provides review on all manner of different things, and another one called WTF Smithers. So, I think this is where the roles between staff communications, corporate communications, and elected official communications really diverge. And when you have a hot, controversial thing and people are out there slugging it out on some social media forum, I think that's really a place where elected officials can wade into the fray if they so choose. But it's probably not a great spot to put our staff or have any expectation that they engage in those sorts of things. And I think I've been somewhat had some good results in terms of intervening. Now people will tag me in a discussion. If a discussion gets really hot, someone will go in and just tag me so that I get a message that says, hey, something's going on, someone wants you to know about. And then you can go in, you can clear up information. If people have inaccurate information, the bike racks didn't cost $1 million, they cost $20,000, big difference. So you can clear up information. You can also invite people to a conversation offline, and I find that's really effective, is give people your cell number, say, hey, when can we meet, call town hall and set up a meeting. If you take it offline, often the behavior and the interaction is much more pleasant. And then the final thing is, I think there's a real opportunity to turn those discussions and those interactions into a positive, and to try to give people opportunities to have their voice heard and maybe validate what they're struggling with, what they're frustrated by. Because often in all of this, there's a little germ of truth in there somewhere that's ticking people off.
That's so true. That's so true. Some really sage words of advice there. And certainly from the voice of experience, too. I was with the two different types of Facebook pages, and these are happening. Local governments across British Columbia that I'm working with are dealing with this, and everybody's trying to figure out, how do we do this? Do we get in the game? Do we not get in the game? What does that look like? And you mentioned something there about the elected ability, the ability of your elected official to be able to jump into a conversation versus a staff person or an administrator. And I'm just wondering, Renee, not to put you on the spot, but have you had that experience at the regional district in terms of the administration side and how you're managing those types of Facebook pages?
Yeah, I don't believe a lot of our elected officials actually are all that active in social media. There may be some exception with the Prince George councillors that serve on our board. For us, and we have the community boards that exist as well, like every community. I monitor a few of them, and it's there's no real sort of hard and fast rule for me. I've found I'll interject, identify myself as being with regional district, and really it's more just a case of if there's just blatant misinformation that's getting put out there and discussed, then I'll just kind of inject myself into the conversation to say, no, this is in fact what we're charging for that, or this is the hours that have changed, or whatever the issue may be. And then, like Mayor Backrack said, if it continues to be contentious or what have you, then invite the people to contact you offline. The more you can kind of take that argument offline, because I don't want to get any. I kind of find sort of once you're responding sort of more than twice on something, then you're just kind of having an argument for everyone to see, and that's when you need to take that offline.
Mm-hmm. And that's interesting. Jay Bear, who's one of my favorite pundits in social media, talks about his 2 response rule: twice and no more. One thing I wanted to ask you, though, is that I find it interesting that there's been different discussions I've been having with CAOs across British Columbia about, do we engage on their page or our page? And there's, with some trepidation that folks do go on to that other community page and correct the incorrect. And that's interesting. So it really is, to me, situational, but I notice there's a reticence, I think, on some, because you never know what you're going to open in terms of some kind of Pandora's box or some kind of conversation with that. So, but you folks, it sounds like you folks, you will go in and correct the incorrect on a community page.
On occasion. I mean, I don't want to build the expectation that we're monitoring those and that that's a way to get in touch with us.
Yeah.
So if I want to move the conversation to our channel, then sometimes what I will do is, I'll say, hi, it's Renee from Regional District. Here's some information we just posted on our Facebook page, and then have that link there. And if people want to take it up with us there, then great. But it doesn't happen a lot for us, but it does happen. So for us, like I said, it's more of we kind of look at it case by case.
Right, exactly. It does need that lens. That's good to hear, though, because I really think that, it's good to hear this conversation because there is differences of opinions of how you do that, and also whether you can support once you step into that other page, whether you have the resources to do it. Going back to the fact that social media is a form of ongoing engagement, but it does mean you need to be there. That's great. Any other wrap-up comments? That's it for our questions. Any closing comments from Taylor? Any closing comments to wrap us up?
No, I think this has been a fun discussion, and thanks to everyone for joining in on the webinar. And it certainly sparked a couple of ideas in my mind, and thanks for allowing me to be a part of it.
Oh, thank you for being a part of it. Renee, closing comments?
Just a thank you, and again, really heartened to see the investment local governments are making in communications, so keep it up.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Kim?
Same echoes from me. Thank you very much, Jen, for coordinating this and having everybody online talking about these topics. It's really great to have conversations about how complex communicating information can actually be.
Absolutely. And please give our regards to Joel. And again, hats off to Joel and the Northern Development Initiative Trust for bringing this brainchild to fruition. It's an award-winning playbook. We're going to send you an email out with a link where you can get yours, and also a recording to today's webinar. Thank you to everybody for joining us today. All the best to you in your communication journey.